When I'm documenting things in Done, I like to use visual diagrams to explain things. I think typically when we are writing documentation with README files or with long form wikis, first of all, it's hard to write about code that way. It's hard to know where to start, where to end, what to explain exactly. There's just so much to explain about code. And even further, it's hard to read because if I'm reading a very long piece of documentation, I don't know, it just doesn't speak to me to read it like I'd read an article in a newspaper or something like that. The way you learn about code, I think, is to kind of see the bigger picture as quickly as possible, and then dig into the specific parts when you need to. And I think that's where a visual diagram just really makes more sense. So I want to show you a few diagrams that I've made for various parts of explaining the Done architecture. I happen to use diagrams.net for my diagrams. Nothing special about it in particular, it just has all the tools I need, and also syncs up with Google Drive, so it's really convenient. So this is the diagram that I created for our billing system. We integrate with Stripe, and billing is a really complex part of a SaaS app if you've if you've done it before. And so one of the things I like about diagrams is that you can essentially flatten your code. So if you think about, everything we do in code is about scoping, about encapsulation, about making sure certain pieces don't know about other pieces and they talk through an interface. And these are all really good things, but when you're trying to understand the high level view of code, it's really hard to unravel all of the good stuff you're doing in programming, because the way you're trying to understand it is totally different than the way you're going to be writing it. And so diagrams are a great way to flatten your code base. So you're talking about everything sort of on an equal plane, even though in this diagram there are things that are happening in different physical parts. Some things are happening in Stripe, some things are happening on our end, some things are happening in ActiveCampaign, which is a third-party service we use to handle email campaigns and things like that. That's number one. One of the reasons I like about diagramming is you can flatten your code essentially and see everything in one place. The other thing I like about it, and I'm not going to dig into a lot of the details of this in terms of billing itself, but I just want to highlight the things that I like to do in diagramming. You'll notice that up here, I'm describing essentially the life cycle of a user, from creating a subscription to going through the trial, things that happen a few days before the trial with regards to sending out emails to let them know that their trial is almost going to expire, and if they've entered a credit card or not. Different things happen. And then during the course of a billing cycle, if they're adding or removing users, there's prorations involved. If they're wanting to cancel immediately or cancel at the end of their period or change their plan at the end of the period, how does all that happen? All that stuff I'm describing in this one document. And so one of the things I like is I can use color to just show different parts of the system. Everything in green is happening in Stripe. Everything in blue is happening in ActiveCampaign. There's some other things here that are quite complex that I reference in a color that I then blow out in these other sub diagrams. So again, to write this stuff in an essay form would be really tedious. I don't know how you'd really be able to understand it well, and I don't know who would want to read something that long and that detailed. The one thing I notice about written documentation is oftentimes I'll have the experience of learning a code base and having a specific question that I can't figure out, and my immediate inclination is to go to the documentation to see if that question's been answered, and inevitably it usually isn't answered. I've found that when I'm doing diagrams like this, more often than not, if I have a question, I've had that question before. I've come back to the same problem I had maybe a year ago or a couple years ago, and back then when I had that question, I went to this diagram. Maybe something was not explained completely, and I've added to it. And so you'll see all these areas where I've added various notes that can just talk about anything regarding particular nuances of this part of the billing process that I want to describe. And inevitably, I'll come back to these notes because I had those same questions before. I don't get that experience a lot with written documentation in a normal README file form. So that's another thing I really like about it. It's just much more conducive to wanting to maintain the diagram, to maintain the documentation, and therefore it makes it much more useful. And that's one of the other things that's nice about diagrams is, first of all, it's more like code, right? You've got boxes and arrows that can show transitions, that can show flow, and that flow isn't necessarily even through code. It could be just flow through time. Right here, we're talking about a user's journey through the complete billing cycle from trial to recurring payments and things like that. It's much easier to do this visually through a diagram. I don't have to have or be constrained by the rules of programming. In programming, we spend a lot of time, just straining ourselves to make sure that we're staying true to good principles. If there is something else we need to add, we need to make sure, is this the right scope? Is this the right place we need to do it? We're refactoring constantly. Again, all great things, important things in code. But when you're documenting it, it's nice to be able to just quickly go, you know what, I always want to add a note here. I just want to say, let me explain this part of the process more in this little section here, even though maybe in code you wouldn't do that same thing. You wouldn't want to have this piece know about that piece. In documentation, you're just trying to explain the system. So it's totally cool to just say, hey, by the way, the reason that we're doing this is because in this other part of the system, X, Y, and Z are happening. So there's like a liberation I get when I am diagramming that is a nice getaway from the code we're writing. I want to show you another example here of the account creation flow. So whereas in the previous one, I was describing more of the overall billing system, this is actually talking about just the account creation flow from the trial sign up, or I'm sorry, from when a user enters their email address to receive a registration link to finishing the trial. And you can see here, I'm again using color to differentiate, in this case, between different layers of the Done app. We have both a .NET part of the application and a view part of the application in terms of front end, and then we also have an API that's written in .NET. So those are shown in green for the .NET front end side, purple for the Vue.js front end side, and then this peach color for various API calls to the .NET side. But the one thing I want to call out here is there's this large section here with all these white boxes, and I'll blow it up a little bit here just so you can see there's basically a conditional flow here, a bunch of if-else conditionals that describe ultimately the screen we want to present to the user when they are going through the initial sign up for their account, because based on their previous interactions with Done, we might want to show them something new. In other words, if they're a completely new user, we just give them the regular sign up form. But if they're already on an existing account, we might present them with that information in the beginning. If they're on another trial, we have a different thing we want to show them. If they're on an expired trial, we might want to tell them that they have a trial already that they can go back to, things like that. So in code, this entire section here really amounts to one method that has a bunch of conditional logic within it. And if you're just looking at code and you're kind of going through that process through all these various code bases, that little piece, that one method amongst many methods spanning across multiple applications, might get lost. But here in a diagram form, we can call it out as a very important part of this account registration flow. And so not only does diagramming let you flatten your code, so you're kind of stripping away all those constraints of scope and encapsulation, but it also lets you describe prominence in a different way. That one little method doesn't seem like a lot in terms of the entirety of all the code we're writing in terms of maybe lines of code, but it's actually a very important part of understanding the complexity of the account registration. So in this section here, we're able to blow that out and show that visually. And so if somebody's reading this account creation diagram, they can see where, they can see things that are more important than they might have first appeared if they're just looking at code. So that's a look at just a couple of diagrams I wanted to show you. And again, I really like the idea of using visual diagrams to document your code. I just think it's a better use of your time, both as the writer of the documentation and the reader. So I hope you enjoyed this.